without health, your freedom is snatched away in a heck of a rush. And there is no freedom when you're hooked up to a dialysis machine. And that's when he really understood that. And I think that's when he got that, life was more precious than potato chips.
Bienvenidos a Volver al Futuro Podcast, donde platicamos con las mentes que nos impulsan a crear el nuevo paradigma de salud y bienestar, conducido por Víctor Sadia.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have today with us Brenda Davis.
Brenda Davis es nutrióloga de renombre internacional. Además de su consulta clínica y sus servicios de consultoría en salud pública y privada con empresas transnacionales, Brenda es profesora, conferencista y autora de varios artículos de investigación. También es coautora de 12 libros de veganismo con más de 1 millón de copias vendidas. En 2007 fue incluida en el Salón de la Fama Vegano de la Sociedad Norteamericana de Vegetarianos. Es una gran de estilo de vida para cambiar las enfermedades crónicas al mismo tiempo que atender el calentamiento global, el abuso a animales y la hiper-industrialización del sistema alimentario.
Brenda, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my absolute honor and privilege. Thanks, Victor.
So my first question is a personal one. You are very accomplished, you work a lot, you work out a lot, you cook for yourself, and yet you're always smiling. I must say that I didn't know you, but when we were really chatting over email, I could really feel your energy. So I won't ask what's your secret. I know it's lifestyle medicine, just kidding. But how has your personality evolved over time in your life, in the last 4 decades, for example?
I'm 61 years old, and I honestly can say I haven't changed much. I think I've been a very positive, happy person. I love everybody, and that's just always been my personality. So I feel very blessed for that. And my mom's the same. I don't think I've ever heard my mom say a bad word about anyone in her life. She just very positive and very uplifting kind of soul. And so I feel very, very fortunate that I have that disposition. I always try to see the best in people, and I always try to find the joyfulness in life and in all of the people I'm privileged to know.
Was that part of the reason why you decided to be a registered dietitian and help people?
Well, in high school, I started getting really interested in food and nutrition. And I really thought about being a lawyer for years. And then I just thought I really want to work in the field of health. And so I ended up switching my ideas and moving in that direction. And I'm really grateful that I did. I just find it so rewarding to change a life so dramatically and profoundly. And I have to say that I don't know of that many realms where you can make that big of a difference in the lives of so many individuals. And our health choices are choices for many of us, not for everyone, because some people are in a refugee camp, or they don't have the privilege of being able to select their foods or even their fitness. Those of us who do are privileged. And to me, with privilege comes responsibility. And so, we have this one body that has to last us and do us well for our whole lives. And I can say at my age, I'm a grandmother, I'm a mother, I'm in my 60s now. And I honestly can say I don't feel that much different than I did when I was in my 30s. I can still run as fast. rest. I can still do all of the things I always enjoyed doing. And that's not, it's not the luck of the draw. I've made good choices. I make good choices where my food intake is concerned. I make good choices where, when I was 15 or 16 years old, I can remember promising to myself that I would never consume things I could become addicted to, because I always felt like that would affect my ability to do what I needed to do in life. And I didn't know what I needed to do at that point, but I wanted so much to live a meaningful life. And so I decided that could affect my ability to live a meaningful life. And so I made the choice not to do that. And so all my life, I've been directed towards making a difference and trying to make the world a more compassionate place. And so with that, of course, came making the best choices I could. And of course, being a person, we all make mistakes and we all make bad choices from time to time. But generally, I think from the time I was 16, 17, I've exercised every day and I've tried my best to eat healthy foods.
Tell me something. How much of that outlook of life that you said you inherited from your mother about this positive, looking for meaning, really affects the possibility of choosing a lifestyle? In other words, you have people who really grow up in families where their default lenses through which they look their lives are more gloomy, are more pessimistic in a way. And because of that, those choices tend to be in a different direction. What's your experience traveling the world and meeting so many people with food choices and this paradigm of how you look life?
Yes, and I think, it's such a riveting topic, really. And I think that I feel sad for people that are in that situation and who haven't had the privilege of understanding healthy versus unhealthy choices, or who see the glass always sort of half empty, have that mentality. But those individuals sometimes are the most powerful of all. Because when they get it and when they make changes themselves and start to see the repercussions of those changes, they can become the greatest voices of all. And they can move people around them because they can see the dramatic shift that happened in their lives. And it gives an inspiration, a greater motivation for people and inspiration for people around them. So no matter what your circumstances, I came from a family, a wonderfully loving family. But my father, I can remember when I was about 20, 21 years of age, I was in school for nutrition. I wanted to do this so much. And his favorite foods were potato chips and Coke. And he loved licorice and candies and I remember he smoked 2 packs a day. He didn't exercise. He had a really unhealthy lifestyle, so much so that our house was the favorite house of all my friends to come to because we always had 3 kinds of cake and 4 kinds of ice cream. My dad, he came from a family of 13 children. They didn't have anything. And so he just wanted to have everything. And he was one of those bigger than life kind of people. And so everything was done big. And so our, Friday nights we had filet mignon often, it was just, everything was done that way. We would have these, huge seafood dinners. And so I didn't come from a family that was super health conscious by any stretch. But I got myself that health was really important. And I remember having this discussion with my dad. I'll never forget him walking by me with 2 cigarettes hanging out of his mouth, his chips and a big, huge bottle of Coke and candies under one arm. And he stuck his belly out and looked at me and just kind of had this cheeky grin, like, see what I can do. And I was in my nutrition program and I was so scared that he was going to die. He was only in his 40s. But I remember saying to him, I don't get why you do this. Like, we want you to be around for a long time, and you're putting your life at risk. And he said, you have to understand that I would rather live 50 years doing all the things I love to do than live 75 having to, restrict this and restrict that. I want the freedom to enjoy the things I enjoy. And he said, I could get hit by a truck tomorrow. And I remember responding, I know, Dad, but it doesn't mean you have to walk out in front of one. And, my dad, it was probably about 2 years after that interaction that he had a stroke in school. He was a high school teacher, and he had a stroke, and he got taken to the hospital, and his blood glucose was over 500 milligrams per deciliter. I mean, it was just beyond wild. And his blood pressure was 220 over 110, and, just everything. And they said he had had a heart attack at some point. And anyway, he was in really rough shape. And I remember the doctor saying to him that if he didn't stop smoking, he might live 3 months. And if he did, he might have 3 years. He had destroyed all of his blood vessels, and they said, they're going to put these, tubes from his heart into his legs, this grafting, and hope that might give him a couple of extra years, but they can't do it unless he stops smoking. And I can remember sitting on my dad's hospital bed, and the tears were coming down my cheeks and his cheeks. And I remember him saying to me, I don't want to die. He said, I've always wanted to dance with my sweetheart at our 50th wedding anniversary. He was so in love with my mom. And he said, I want to see my grandchildren grow up. I don't even have grandkids yet, and all of these things. And I think it was at that moment that my father really got that without health, your freedom is snatched away in a heck of a rush. And there is no freedom when you're hooked up to a dialysis machine. And that's when he really understood that. And I think that's when he got that, life was more precious than potato chips or Coke. And so he made some really significant changes. And I'm happy to say he lived for another probably about 25, 26 years after that prognosis. And no, he didn't make the kinds of changes that I wish he would have, but he made enough to survive for a lot longer than he was expected to. So, it's just the choices we make. And, the one thing that I think it's important for people to understand is, I ate filet mignon and lobster, and I ate all of the fancy rich ice creams and all of those things. And I can honestly say that I think I enjoy my food more now than I did when I was eating those foods. I appreciate so much the taste of a fresh tomato from the garden. I appreciate the flavors that come from fresh, wholesome foods. And I love my meals. I don't feel like I've sacrificed anything. If anything, I think it's even better than the highly processed foods, the garbage foods that really derange our palates. They derange our palates because as human beings, we're hardwired to be drawn to the flavors of fat, sugar, and salt, because in nature, those flavors are so dilute that we're hardwired to go for them. And when you get a manufacturer of some processed food that takes and concentrates them so that we hit this bliss point really quickly, it causes us it kind of overruns our appetite control center, and we can't stop eating. And we end up overeating these foods, and it's killing us. And that's what we have to understand. We've got to fight back against this kind of co-opting of our brains with these kinds of hyper palatable foods. And we can do that. We can just say, sometimes you need to, you almost need to go and say, I'm not going to eat any of it. And within 3 or 4 weeks, your palate has totally adjusted. It's like people that go from drinking whole milk to drinking skim milk. At first, the skim milk would taste like water, but once you've had it for a long time and you go back to drinking whole milk, the whole milk would taste like cream. And so there's those kinds of adjustments that happen very naturally when you change your choices.
Thank you so much for sharing that personal story. And unfortunately, I think, that's just an archetype of society, the way that we eat and think about our processed food. So you've talked about these, you have to embrace a new mindset, but not only individually, but culturally. Because at the end of the day, those choices are not only mediated by when you walk in the supermarket, but also by your expectations of what a supermarket should be. And that's also mediated by the way the community responds to health and responds to illness at the same time. In your work in the Marshall Islands, for example, how do you see culture grabbing this attention on lifestyle, and how can we change culturally to a new way of seeing and doing things?
Yeah, and it's such an important question, because I think as human beings, again, we're hardwired to care about our tribe and being part of a tribe. And I think it almost supersedes our desire for life itself. We want to belong. And if our choices mean we no longer belong, we don't want to make those choices. It's just so important that we fit in somewhere. And so it's a really, really deep question. And for those of you that aren't familiar with my work in the Marshall Islands, in 2006, so this is a few years ago, I went into the Marshall Islands with a team of researchers to the Marshall Islands. If you don't know where they are, they're sort of halfway between Hawaii and Australia. They're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with nothing within a couple thousand miles of any direction, in any direction. And it's a culture that is very, very socially engaged. They have a spirit that is just so beautiful. They laugh all the time. The children have nothing, and yet they're the happiest children I've ever seen. They just, they have such a rich engagement with others all the time. They're not in front of computers. They're a wonderful, interesting society. But the problem is they have the highest rates of diabetes on the planet, and with rates of 37% of adults with type 2 diabetes. And what's really interesting is 100 years ago, or even 80 years ago, diabetes was pretty much non-existent there. They didn't have any diabetes. And what people would say, well, what happened? Diabetes is not the luck of the draw. Diabetes is a disease of diet and lifestyle. And type 2 diabetes, I'm talking about, not type 1 diabetes, which is very different, but type 2 diabetes, which is a disease of insulin resistance. What happened was these people went from living off the land, where their food was coconut and pandanus and taro and green leaves and all of whatever was growing on the land, and whatever they could get out of the ocean, the fish and the seaweed and whatever, that was their food. And they had to work hard to get that food. Climbing coconut trees and spearing fish and whatever it was hard work. They went from living like that to living on with way greater population than their islands could sustain. So they had to import foods. And the importation of foods for poor people tends to be really cheap processed food. So a lot of white sticky rice and spam and non-perishable meats in cans, and these, drinks that are mainly sugar and color, and just cheap foods, ramen noodles, deep fried ramen noodles, and soda and these kinds of foods. And so they went from living off the land to living off of highly processed foods. And in doing so, well, the diet that, honestly, the diet they had adopted was really the ideal diet for inducing diabetes. So to the extent that if you can even imagine the children, their favorite snack was ramen noodles dried out of the package with Kool-Aid powder sprinkled on top. It's unbelievable, but that's the kind of food people were eating. Breakfast was donuts with coffee or with children, whatever they wanted, popsicles, it didn't matter, and the adults and the children, lunch and dinner were always sticky rice with some sort of meat and a sweet drink. Vegetables and fruits, we didn't see them eating many of those at all. And so when we went in to the Marshall Islands and provided a lifestyle treatment program, the changes in people's health was really dramatic. One of the things that we noticed was people were often going to the bathroom, having a bowel movement once a week or even less than once a week because they weren't eating any fiber. They were eating 4 or 5 grams a day quite often. And when they started eating the diet that we were providing, they would go to the bathroom every single day. And for some of them, it scared them. It was unusual for them. And so very dramatic shifts. Their blood sugar started to normalize. We got them doing, walking after meals, physical activity every day. And so it really transformed even their brain. So many people said my brain was like it was in a fog, and it was like the fog just lifted. And so the changes in the pain in their joints, their ability to walk any kind of distance, all of that just changed so dramatically, so quickly. And they were stunned because most of them really believed that diet had nothing to do with their diabetes. And so it was really shocking for them when they realized that it had everything to do with their diabetes. But it's really tricky because in the Marshall Islands, people live in tiny little tiny homes with sometimes 12 people or even more. And they have one pot of rice to cook. And then they open a couple cans of meat to eat with that. And so for them to all of a sudden adopt a healthy diet with fruits and vegetables, it's very, very difficult. Most of them had never even tasted beans like lentils or black beans or pinto beans. And so they didn't even know what they were. And so this was a huge, learning curve for them. But it was interesting because they were open to trying things. And in the Marshall Islands, when somebody's doing something, other people want to try as well. And so it kind of, it migrated out into the broader community fairly quickly. And so we're starting to see some changes, but to be really honest, the changes we see mostly are in people that have a little bit higher means, so they're able to afford to buy foods at the farmers market. And so it's a very challenging when you're talking about poor people. And one of the things we tried to teach them is, to grow their own foods, to grow sprouts, to use things that a lot of poor people thrive on, beans. And they could continue to eat rice, but instead of canned meat, to put some nicely flavored beans on top would make a big difference for them. So those kinds of things those were our focus, of course.
Thank you for going in detail in that, because in Mexico, it's much the same. Although, I just Googled the population in Marshall Islands, it's almost 60,000 people, which is basically what we find in a mid-sized neighborhood in Mexico City.
Yeah.
And in the last 25 years, there has been that specific change that you just described, and we changed our diet, and diabetes has grown 5-6x in the last 25 years, and it's now becoming the leading cause of death in Mexico. So, I always think it's important not to stigmatize, and basically in poor countries where it's not only a matter of choice, but also of availability. And there's this intricate system of distribution and marketing and production of industrial foods. At the same time that there's governments and pharmaceuticals interests really working together to, I think you have called it diabetes by design.
Yes, exactly.
So in this sense, and I think we can use this example from the Marshall Islands and in your 40 years experience in the field. In Mexico, there's a new emerging movement in lifestyle medicine, and we're trying to legitimize and show people that chronic disease, lifestyle related disease, not only can be prevented or controlled with lifestyle, but it can even be reversed. What's your experience with this?
Well, what's really, really interesting is we tend to, with lifestyle-induced diseases, we as our healthcare systems tend to try to reduce the symptoms, but often we don't try to change the causes or get right to the root causes. And when we do that, miracles start to happen. And so I can tell you, even if you just compare, we've been following, and then I'll get to the reversal. But even if you compare people that eat plant-based diets and live healthy lifestyles, we've actually been following 3 cohorts, which are very interesting. One is the EPIC Oxford cohort, and we've been following these people since 1993. One is the Adventist Health Study 2, and this is since 2002, about 96,000 people, and the EPIC Oxford is about 65,000 people. And then there's a third cohort in Taiwan with about 6,000 people. And in all of these cohorts, well, in the first 2 cohorts, we compare omnivores, and this is all health-conscious individuals. So health-conscious omnivores, pesco-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, vegans, and the same with the Seventh-day Adventists, and then with the Buddhist from Taiwan, it's just vegetarian versus non-vegetarian. But in all of these cohorts, the entire cohort dies at about half the rate of the general population. So here we're comparing omnivores who drink the same amount, smoke the same amount, exercise the same amount as their vegetarian counterparts. And yet, where diabetes is concerned, in the Adventist Health Study 2, they had about 62% less diabetes. In the Taiwanese cohort, they had about 75% less for women and about 50% less for men. And in the EPIC Oxford cohort, it was, I think, 43 or so percent, or maybe even a little higher percent less for the vegans, a little less for the lacto-ovo-vegetarians. But in the people eating, completely plant-based diets, the differences in the rates of diabetes were really quite astonishing, particularly because we weren't comparing them to people eating a standard American diet with lots of fast foods. We were comparing them to really health-conscious omnivores. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing is in terms of reversal. Well, diabetes is a disease of insulin resistance. So, and it's also a disease, it's a disease, the insulin resistance is a product of several things. It's a product of low-grade inflammation. It's a product of oxidative stress. It's a product of dysbiosis or an unhealthy gut microbiome because you're not feeding the microbes in your gut the fiber they need that are, so critical to health. And it's a disease of lipotoxicity, which means you're storing fat in organs and in your liver and in your muscle tissue. You're storing fat in those places where fat is really meant to be stored in adipose tissue. And so when you store a lot of fat in your liver, it promotes insulin resistance. And so here we've got this disease of insulin resistance. Well, if you start to follow a diet and an exercise program that improves the gut microbiome, that reduces inflammation, that reduces oxidative stress, that reduces the body fat stores so that it increases your insulin sensitivity, the disease starts to reverse itself. Now, in many people, complete reversal is possible, but in some people, they've done so much damage to the pancreas because they've had it for so many years and their beta cells start to actually die out. In these individuals, it may not be completely reversible, but in many people, it is completely reversible, and I see it all the time. And I think one of the most powerful stories for me was a man, his name was Carlos, and Carlos, he had type 2 diabetes for 20 years. He had a major heart attack. He had hypertension and high cholesterol and peripheral artery disease, and he had super high blood pressure, and he was in early stage renal failure. He had recurring gout. He had cataracts. He had everything. He was being treated on about 40 units of insulin a day. day and 17 medications. And his doctors told him that he had progressive irreversible diseases and that he had just a few years to live at most. And that was that. And there was nothing he could do about it. Well, Carlos, his son, got diagnosed at 36 years of age with cancer. And his son was a big foodie. He loved steak and wine and all of these things. But after a lot of research, he decided to go 100% plant-based. And his whole entire family, including his dad, Carlos, said, you know what, we're just going to do whatever you're doing, just to support you so we can eat as a family. He never expected it would do anything for him. Within a year, Carlos was completely off all 17 medications and off all his insulin. His fasting glucose was absolutely normal. His A1C was about 5.1. His blood pressure was 115/70 with no medications. His arteries opened up. We had PET scans to show that. His peripheral artery disease disappeared. His kidney function actually returned to normal. He had not one single further recurrence of gout. And his doctor, he went to his doctor and he said, I don't understand why you didn't tell me. All I had to do is change my diet and start exercising, and this I could reverse all of my diseases. And his doctor said, well, I didn't tell you because I didn't know. Nobody ever taught us that in school, you know, and this is what we're seeing over and over again. I mean, Carlos's story is quite remarkable and is more than what some people will achieve, but it's only more than what some people will achieve because he went to the nth degree to make it happen. I mean, his diet was as clean can be, and he was exercising regularly. He really went to town on changing his lifestyle. And so, you know, he did a lot of green juices and, you know, just boosting his antioxidant status and reducing his inflammation and just all of those things. But I love that story because of how he didn't even do it for himself. He did it for his son and never expected any of those changes for himself. And that is really what is possible. And I, you know, it makes me sad to think that people don't know that's what's possible because, and they don't know because their physicians don't tell them. And so I believe with all my heart that physicians have a responsibility to lay options out on the table for their patients. And so many physicians have said to me, well, you know, I don't tell my patients that because my patients won't do that. And I always say, how do you know? You know, how do you know? You don't know what your patients will do necessarily unless you lay out the options. Your patients, if you were telling a patient who has heart disease that they have a choice between getting their chest cut open and having a bunch of bypasses that'll probably get clogged up again in 5 years versus changing their diet, hey, they might decide to change their diet. And especially in a place like Mexico, where people actually know how to eat beans and make beans taste good. You know, they have those healthy foods at the foundation of their traditional diet.
You know what? And the problem is not only that they don't give the options, but they believe that there's only one option, which is slowly decline until you die. And that really conditions the expectations of the patient. And if that's what he has seen in his town, in his communities, you know, in his own family, then he will just reproduce what he has seen. And the doctor will just say, well, that's the only reality. So I wanted to ask you about how did you get involved with the lifestyle medicine movement and how has it been for you to be, you know, working alongside, and I heard you just won an award with, you know, Dr. Ornish and the Barnards and the Michael Gregors and the Esselstyns and Dr. Katz and all these legends of lifestyle medicine. How have you really interacted with them and how do you see that cohort of really warriors, in a sense, to move forward the agendas in so many arenas?
Yes, well, you know, I can remember back when I was a public health nutritionist back in about 1985 or 6, and I started getting interested in what I might call the bigger picture. And the bigger picture meaning the consequences of our food choices for ourselves, but also beyond ourselves. And I started thinking about the connection between our food choices and the environment, the connection between our food choices and the animals that become our food. And so I started looking more deeply and really digging into this whole lifestyle lifestyle medicine discussion. And I can remember in 1990-ish when the lifestyle heart trial appeared, getting very excited and thinking we're really on to something here. And I read about Dr. Michael Clapper and Dr. John McDougall and Dr. Dean Ornish. At that time, those were the big names. And then Dr. Barnard. And then along came Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Campbell and, Dr. Michael Greger. I've known Michael Greger for over 25 years, I think. And I can remember, if you can imagine this, I can remember a time when Michael Greger said to me, Brenda, do you think that I could ever learn to do a PowerPoint presentation? And he was using these little cue cards, to do his presentations. And I said, I think you could be really good at it. Now I think back to those early days and what he's done with social media and his nutritionfacts.org and all of these amazing. He's a workhorse. He just never stops. And I've had the privilege. He and I went to Saudi Arabia together to do a consult for the prince there, and I've worked closely with the founder of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, John Kelly. We did the Marshall Islands research together, and we went to Lithuania to do a lifestyle medicine demonstration for the government and the medical school there. And so I was able to do a little bit as a nutrition consultant for Dr. Ornish's program, and I just finished having a trip in Iceland with the Esselstyns. We were speaking together there, and I mean, we speak at conferences together often, but we've all, it's a relatively small community, and so being sort of that dietitian voice amongst all of the physicians has been, I think, valuable because for many of them, their background and experience has been a little different than mine. And so my voice coming into it, I think it has helped to move the envelope further in terms of fine tuning and really understanding how to prepare food in a way that is the most protective. And so, for example, Michael Greger and I, when we were on the plane, he was saying to me how, he had shifted from rolled oats to steel cut oats. And I looked at him and I said, well, why aren't you eating oat groats? And it's so it's just as because my area has been food and nutrition that I keep pushing myself to take that next step and the next step. And so I've created this thing called the whole grain hierarchy, for example, which is, people get the idea they need to eat whole grains. And so they buy whole wheat bread and they buy, whole wheat cookies or whatever. They buy all brown rice cakes and all of these processed whole grains. But what they don't understand sometimes is that there are differences in the quality of whole grains depending on the level of processing of those grains. And so at the top of the hierarchy, you have grains as they're almost picked off the plant, maybe just the outer hull removed. And so you're talking about intact grains like oat groats and kamut berries and quinoa and black or brown rice and barley and all of these truly intact grains. And you could sprout the grains or you could cook them. And then next on the list would be the cut grains like steel cut oats, and then the rolled grains, and then the shredded grains, and then the ground grains like flours, and then the flaked grains where you've mixed the flours and created flakes, and then the puffed grains where you're subjecting them to 1,500 pounds of pressure and destroying a lot of nutrients. And as you go down this list, you're actually increasing the damage to the nutrients in those foods. You're increasing the surface area of the food, so you're increasing the glycemic impact of those foods or the rate at which they'll be absorbed into the bloodstream. So even if you completely eliminate refined grains, even within that whole grain world, there really is a hierarchy where at the very top of the list. You've got very low glycemic index. You've got all the nutrition there. You've got maximum impact of the fiber because those fiber particles are large. And so, we just have to understand. And also, as you go down the list, often you're adding things. So nobody eats a bowl of flour. I mean, you add stuff to whatever you're making. Often it's salt and sugar and fat and all sorts of things. So there's a difference there, and we just need to appreciate that. And so I find often with the physicians who've been so focused on the medical side of things that sometimes they don't have the time or the knowledge of the training in nutrition to really figure those little intricacies out. So we've had a wonderful partnership in that way, and I've been able to contribute in that fine tuning of the diet.
What's their mood like? In the last 25, 30 years, much has happened in the lifestyle medicine arena. And, you could argue that we are really moving forward. What's the mood in general? Do we still feel that there's a lot to do and there's no way that we will achieve something, or we really feel that we're making progress? And second, we are just beginning to launch this movement in Mexico. And,
Yes.
Lifestyle medicine is not, as a concept, is not new, but as an academic practice might be understood that way. What would you suggest all these physicians and nutritionists and psychologists and coaches who are really thinking about incorporating these tools into their clinical toolbox?
Well, I would say, first of all, that, I've been watching this sort of unfold over several decades. And I can say I am excited at where we're at. And I didn't know if we would ever be at this point in my lifetime because, and just for example, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, when it started, which I can't remember what year, but it wasn't very many years ago, maybe 15 years at the most. It was very small. They maybe had 100 people at their annual meeting. Now they're having to shut down registration at 1,500 people. They have, lifestyle medicine organizations or branches all over the world now. They have board certification for physicians. It's unbelievable. We have the Plantrition Project with their annual plant-based healthcare conference. And it was the same story. They had just 100 people or so at the beginning, and now they're way over 1,000 participants in their annual meetings. And so we're seeing this tremendous growth. And the people in countries like Mexico, where it's just starting to take root, the physicians that really understand this and who want to see their patients get well instead of continuing to get sicker. And what physician wouldn't want that? These physicians that adopt these practices, two things. Number one is that you want to form a team as much as possible to get so that you can provide the kind of support your patients need to succeed. And I think that's just hugely, hugely important. But you will, that's one thing. And the second is, as an individual practicing physician, you will be a pioneer in your country, and you will be absolutely stunned at the changes that you see in your patients. And those patients, you can form, there can be patient groups, they can help other patients. It always helps to have a tribe. So as you're shifting away from the traditional, or not so much traditional, but the junk way of eating, into a more traditional way of eating, a healthier way of eating, you need to have a tribe to help you get through that. And I would say to physicians that whenever you make a choice that's sort of not the party line, you're straying from the party line, it's scary. And because you don't want to be badly judged by your peers. So I can remember myself when I was a registered dietitian 30 years ago or more, and I had decided to make the shift towards a plant-based diet. I was terrified because everything we did was based on, the 4 food groups, Canada's food guide, and the 4 food groups, 2 of which were animal products, meat and dairy. And it was very scary for me because I thought, how can I be a dietitian and not use the materials that are provided to teach people about nutrition? And I decided that the one thing that I would do is I would read a lot, and I would make sure that my I's were dotted and my T's were crossed, that I could debate anyone on these subjects. And I would read the literature, and that is what I did. And so I started writing books. I just finished writing my 12th book, which is I think the first comprehensive guide for families, and it's called Nourish, the definitive plant-based guide for families. And so these books that I've written or co-authored in many cases have been sort of guidebooks to help people who want to do plant-based do it very well without, falling into any of the potential pitfalls. And that's the other thing that's important to recognize, is there are potential pitfalls. So just going plant-based isn't enough. You need to do it with some education and some knowledge. So when you're eating an omnivorous diet, your risks involved with that diet are more to do with overconsumption and getting too much saturated fat and too much of some of these more harmful dietary components, and not enough of fiber and some of the protective phytochemicals and so on. When you choose, on the other end, a fully plant-based diet, there are some nutrients you need to be concerned about, and one is vitamin B12. You need to make sure you've got a source of iodine and vitamin D, and you need to be sure you're getting a range of foods in your diet, and that you've got a decent source of calcium if you're eliminating dairy products. And so there's more to it than just, I'll eat whatever plants and I'll be fine. You need to be, especially if you're raising a young family, if you ignore vitamin B12, your baby could end up with an irreversible brain damage. And so within a matter of months. So vitamin B12 is not optional, it's imperative. You have to have it. That's why it's called an essential nutrient. And plants are not reliable sources. And that doesn't mean it's a justification for eating animals, because animal products may not be reliable sources if the animals weren't fed. The majority of vitamin B12 supplements produced are fed to animals because our soils don't have as much bacteria and so on. And so it's just, we're cleaning our plant foods before we eat them. We don't just pick them out of the ground where the soil is all full of these bacteria. And so because of that, we need to fortify our foods with B12 or take a B12 supplement. 1,000 micrograms twice a week. It's not expensive. It's easy to do, and that will have us covered. And the other thing to know is that everyone over 50 has a risk for B12 deficiency, because B12 in animal products is bound to protein. And in order to use the B12 in animal products, you have to have the ability to cleave it off the protein it's bound to. And you need enough stomach acid, and you need the enzyme production to be able to do that. And probably as many as 30% of people over 50 don't have that. And so if they rely on animal products for B12, they could end up quite B12 deficient. So they are, the recommendations by our Institute of Medicine are to get your B12 from the same place that a vegan would get their B12, from supplements or fortified foods. So it's not, and when you think about it, there are many foods that are fortified with nutrients. Yeah, globally, we've fortified salt with iodine because iodine's an issue in many places. We've fortified cow's milk with vitamin D because vitamin D is an issue. So when there's a nutrient that's an issue, we just need to take care of it. That's all.
Thank you, Brenda. Before I ask my last question, I wanted to talk about how lifestyle medicine and how living through that lifestyle in general, it's much more than having like a practice, like a spiritual practice, but basically it makes us live spiritually. We are more connected to ourselves, to our planet, to our family. So how do you live all this? And how do you believe that understanding lifestyle, not as something that your physician will prescribe, but a way of thinking, a way of engaging with your life, with your planet, with the miracle of being alive?
Yeah. I love your questions, Victor. You're a very deep thinker. And that's what we all need to be, if we can, if we have the capacity to think a little more deeply, to think about our choices, as I mentioned before, beyond ourselves. And when you think about this little fragile planet, we are taxing the life support systems of this planet beyond what we ever have in the history of humankind or life itself. And we're at a stage right now where many experts are saying by 2030, the oceans will be, beyond repair. We're cutting down rainforests. People are saying we're cutting down rainforests to grow soybeans to make soy milk. No, we're cutting down rainforests to grow soybeans to feed cattle. And people need to recognize that it takes, a fraction of the resources to feed a person eating a plant-based diet that it does to feed a person eating an omnivorous diet. And it may be 1/10 or 1/20 of the resources. It's really not insignificant. And so when you think about the CO2 emissions of beans versus beef, there is no contest. Beans produce very little CO2 emissions compared to beef. And so when we think about trying to leave a soft footprint on the planet, it means eating lower on the food chain. And then if you start thinking about, the repercussions for the animals with whom we share this planet, if you've ever had a pet, a dog or a cat, or, that these little creatures have personalities. They have likes and dislikes. They adore you. They, whatever it is, that they are unique individuals. Every animal is a unique individual with desires and that feels pain and suffering. And there was a study done in California that showed that pigs had the intelligence of about a 3 to 5 year old child, and dogs came in at about 2.5-year-old child. And I looked at some of the studies they were doing and the games they were teaching pigs to play and all of that. And if you think about the way we raise pigs, here are animals that would live about 15 years. They're put into these little stalls indoors where they never see the light of day. The dust and dander and the smell is so bad that we need a face mask or a gas, some sort of protection to go in there. And these are animals that their smellers are 200 times more sensitive than ours. And at the end of the 6 months that they live there, they get trucked to a disassembly plant or a slaughterhouse where a lot of them are inappropriately stunned. They're boiled alive in some cases, and we eat them. And these are really intelligent creatures. And the intelligence may not even matter, but for people often that touches them more when we're talking about animals that really have a brain that understand what's going on around them. And here we slaughter 70 billion land animals every year. It's about 10 times the human population. If you were on another planet looking down at planet Earth, there's a show called Earthlings that kind of, discusses all of this. But basically, I think you would be horrified at what we do. And we have tried to remove these animals from, we put the blinders on because we don't even want to know. But what we do to these animals is absolutely unjustifiable, in my opinion. And every time you buy a piece of meat, you are contributing to a system of cruelty that is absolutely abhorrent. And I think as human beings, we are smart enough to figure out how to produce food without causing pain, suffering, and death in the process. And if we have the capacity to do that, why aren't we doing it? We are civilized. We've got to be more civilized. We've got to be more thoughtful. We've got to be more compassionate as a species if we're going to survive. And that responsibility lies squarely on the shoulders of each and every one of us. And we have to look beyond ourselves. We just must do that.
There's a quote you have on your website, your favorite quotes, and you say a quote from Gandhi that says, "Whenever you are confronted with an opponent, conquer him with love." So I would like you to end this beautiful interview with that message. And, thank you for, your precious and so insightful conversation and spiritual sharing.
Well, Victor, thank you for that quote, because I think so often when we get on a bandwagon, whatever it is, and we, with all our hearts and souls, believe, we want to shout it to the rooftops. We want to hit people over the head with it. We want to say, shake people and say, why aren't you doing this? But we never, ever will bring people on side by spitting in their face. We will bring them on side with love and compassion, and by sharing delicious food, and by laughing with them and respecting them, and just, being a valuable part of our, environment. And so we will never stamp out hate with hate. And we have to remember that. It's so important. We are not at the center of the ethical universe because we've understood this part of ethics. There are many different aspects of ethics, and this is one of them. And so I think we just all have to do with what is within our capacity to do, and do it with love, for sure.
Brenda, thank you so much for this conversation. I wish you all the best.
I wish you all the best too, Victor. Thank you for having me.
Have a good day.
You too.
Nos encantaría recibir tu retroalimentación de estos podcasts para continuar generando contenidos que te sean útiles e interesantes. Si puedes, déjanos un comentario en la página web victorsaadia.com.